Rosewood Lane had always been the quietest street in St. Mary Mead, a polite curve of hedges and well-swept pavements where nothing more scandalous than an unreturned casserole dish ever occurred. That was why the sound of Mrs. Elspeth Turner's scream, sharp and unrestrained, carried so far on that mild autumn morning. By the time neighbours gathered at the iron gate of number 17, the house already felt altered, as though something unseen had shifted its foundations. Mrs. Turner lay sprawled in the small morning room at the back of the house, a teacup shattered beside her, her silver knitting needles scattered like dropped pins. She was quite unmistakably dead. The French windows opening onto the rose garden were locked from the inside, their bolts firmly in place. The single door leading to the hallway was closed, and when the first constable arrived, he had to force it open, breaking the fragile latch. No one could explain how any intruder might have entered or escaped. The housekeeper, who had been polishing the front hall at the time, swore she had heard nothing at all until the scream, and by then it was already too late. The oddity that immediately seized attention was not the locked room, but the object found resting neatly on the small writing desk. It was a child's red glass marble, perfectly round and gleaming in the sunlight, utterly out of place among Mrs. Turner's sensible stationery and unpaid bills. She had no grandchildren, no visitors young enough to play such games, and the marble bore no scratches or marks that suggested it had been rolled in from outside. It seemed deliberately placed, like a signature or a taunt. Inspector Slack arrived with his usual air of weary confidence, moving briskly through the room and declaring the matter most straightforward. Mrs. Turner, he suggested, must have suffered a sudden attack and collapsed. The scream, he reasoned, could be explained by pain or surprise. Yet the doctor, summoned shortly after, shook his head. There was a faint bruise at the base of Mrs. Turner's skull, small but unmistakable, as though she had been struck with something narrow and hard. No weapon was found in the room. No signs of a struggle marred the tidy furniture. Everything appeared too calm, too arranged. By afternoon, the whispers had begun. Rosewood Lane residents peered through their lace curtains, recalling every trivial exchange they had ever had with Mrs. Turner, searching for hidden quarrels or secret habits. She had been quiet, perhaps even dull, a widow who attended church faithfully and kept her roses pruned with military precision. She argued occasionally with her nephew over money, but he was abroad. She had once dismissed a gardener for carelessness, but that had been years ago. Nothing explained the violence of her end. Miss Marple, who lived 2 streets away, heard the news from her friend Mrs. Bantry over tea. She listened without interruption, her pale blue eyes thoughtful above the rim of her cup. Locked rooms, she reflected, were often very misleading things, much like reputations. People assumed they meant impossibility, when in fact they usually suggested careful planning. It was the marble that interested her most. Children's toys had a way of appearing in the least childlike situations, and never without reason. Later that day, with the gentle insistence no one ever quite refused, Miss Marple found herself invited into the Turner house. She moved slowly through the morning room, noticing the faint scent of roses drifting in through the closed windows, the way the rug had been nudged slightly out of alignment near the desk. She bent to examine the marble, lifting it between 2 fingers. It was warm from the sun and heavier than it looked. "How very odd," she murmured, not to anyone in particular. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, faintly amused. "Children drop things all the time, Miss Marple." "Indeed they do," she agreed mildly, "but they usually lose them." She set the marble back exactly where it had been, and glanced at the locked windows, the broken latch, the fallen knitting. To her mind, the scene felt not random but arranged, as though someone had wished it to appear unsolvable. And in her long experience, whenever a crime announced itself as either absurdly simple or impossibly complex, it was neither. It was merely waiting for someone to notice the shadow that did not quite belong, cast quietly across Rosewood Lane. Miss Marple lingered after the inspector had finished his brisk inspection, her presence so unobtrusive that it was easy to forget she was there at all. While Inspector Slack spoke in low tones with the constable near the door, she drifted back to the writing desk, her fingers hovering just above its polished surface. She did not touch anything now. She had learned long ago that the most important impressions were often gathered without disturbing a single object. The desk blotter was neatly aligned, yet the pen lay at a slight angle, as though set down in haste. Mrs. Turner, Miss Marple knew, had been a woman of habit. She would never have left her pen like that unless something had distracted her. A sudden knock, perhaps, or a voice at the window. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the French doors again. Locked from the inside, yes, but glass, even when closed, had a way of carrying sound. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbons, stood wringing her hands near the fireplace, her face pale and blotched. Miss Marple approached her with a sympathetic smile and a murmur about the shock of such a dreadful morning. Mrs. Gibbons responded eagerly, relieved to speak to someone who did not look at her as though she were a suspect. She explained again how she had been in the front hall, polishing the sideboard, when the scream rang out. It had come suddenly, she said, and ended just as quickly. "Did you hear voices before that?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Gibbons frowned. "No, miss. At least, I don't think so. There was the radio in the kitchen earlier, but I turned it off." Miss Marple nodded, as though this confirmed something. She thanked the woman and moved on, her attention now caught by the knitting needles scattered on the floor. One lay farther away than the others, near the edge of the rug. She imagined Mrs. Turner rising from her chair, perhaps startled, perhaps angry, and the needles slipping from her grasp. It suggested movement, not collapse. Inspector Slack returned, glancing at his notebook. "We'll have statements from the neighbours next," he said. "Routine business." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "Routine can be very enlightening." Outside, Rosewood Lane basked in a deceptive calm. Miss Marple joined a small cluster of neighbours who had gathered, each eager to share some fragment of information. Mrs. Holland from number 12 recalled seeing Mrs. Turner at her window just before 11. "Lookee," out toward the garden. Mr. Pierce mentioned a stranger he thought he had seen earlier in the week, a man in a dark coat, though he could not be certain of the day. Each detail was small, easily dismissed, but Miss Marple stored them away with care. What interested her most was young Susan Miller, home from college and standing slightly apart from the others. When asked if she had noticed anything unusual, she hesitated before answering that she had heard a sharp knock sometime that morning. Not a polite knock at the door, she said, but something harder, like rapping on glass. He had assumed it was someone tapping a window to get attention. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And did you look out?" Susan shook her head. "No. I was late for a lecture recording. I didn't think much of it." Later, Miss Marple walked slowly along the edge of Mrs. Turner's rose garden, her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. The roses were immaculate, their stems trimmed with care, but near the French windows the soil was disturbed, as though someone had stood there recently. She bent down, noting the faint impression of a shoe heel. It was not conclusive, but it was suggestive. Inside again, she encountered Inspector Slack questioning Mrs. Turner's nephew by telephone, his voice brisk and sceptical. The nephew sounded suitably distressed and entirely unhelpful, being thousands of miles away. When the call ended, the inspector sighed. No clear motive, no clear suspect, just that blasted marble. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She picked up the marble once more, turning it so the light caught its surface. A tiny chip gleamed near one edge, almost invisible unless one knew to look. "Marbles do chip," she said, "especially when dropped on stone." Inspector Slack looked unconvinced, but Miss Marple had already drifted away, her thoughts knitting themselves together with quiet persistence. Someone had stood outside the locked room, someone had wanted Mrs. Turner's attention, and someone had left behind a small childish object that seemed meaningless, yet was anything but. The deception was slight, almost elegant, and for the moment its purpose remained unclear, but Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. The truth was already present in Rosewood Lane, waiting patiently to be noticed. The questioning began in earnest that same afternoon, and Miss Marple positioned herself where she always learned the most, slightly to one side, appearing interested but harmless. Inspector Slack took charge with his usual efficiency, ushering witnesses one by one into the Turner sitting room, where the air still seemed faintly disturbed, as though the room remembered what had happened. Mrs. Gibbons went first, her account unchanged but increasingly detailed. She described the order of her morning chores with almost painful precision, insisting she had not left the front hall until after the scream. She was eager, too eager, Miss Marple thought, to prove her usefulness. When asked whether anyone had come to the door, Mrs. Gibbons shook her head vigorously. No callers, no deliveries, nothing at all. Yet her hands twisted tighter as she spoke, and she added, unprompted, that Mrs. Turner had been in perfect spirits that morning. Miss Marple wondered why a housekeeper would feel the need to insist upon that. Next came Mrs. Holland, who spoke confidently about seeing Mrs. Turner at the window shortly before 11. She recalled the time precisely because she had just taken a cake from the oven. When Inspector Slack asked which window, she hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the back of the house. "One of the garden windows," she said. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation more than the answer. People who truly remembered details did not usually blur them. Mr. Pierce's testimony was the least useful and the most enthusiastic. He leaned forward, delighted to be involved, recounting again the stranger in the dark coat. Each time he told it, the man seemed to grow taller and more sinister. When pressed for an exact day, Mr. Pierce faltered. It might have been Tuesday, or Monday, or perhaps the previous week. Inspector Slack scribbled dutifully, his expression neutral, while Miss Marple quietly decided that Mr. Pierce's stranger belonged more to imagination than memory. Susan Miller was more difficult. She answered questions carefully, as though weighing each word. She repeated her account of the sharp knock on glass and admitted she had not investigated further. When asked why, she shrugged. It didn't seem important at the time. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed how her eyes flicked toward the garden as she spoke, as if checking that nothing had changed there since morning. Inspector Slack then turned his attention to Mrs. Turner's gardener, a young man named Edwin Clark, dismissed months earlier. Clark appeared defensive from the start, insisting he had no reason to bear a grudge. He spoke quickly, denying he had been anywhere near Rosewood Lane that day. His alibi, a visit to a cousin, was vague and unsupported. Yet there was something oddly rehearsed about his indignation, as though he had anticipated suspicion and prepared himself for it. Throughout it all, Miss Marple listened. She noticed that while accounts differed, they overlapped in curious ways. Everyone seemed certain of times, yet those times did not quite align. Everyone insisted on what they had not seen more than what they had. And no one, not one person mentioned hearing Mrs. Turner speak, only the scream. As the afternoon wore on, Inspector Slack grew faintly irritated. "People see what they want to see," he muttered, closing his notebook, "and remember even less." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And sometimes they remember what is safest." She asked, very gently, whether anyone had spoken to Mrs. Turner through the garden windows before that day. There was a pause, brief but telling. Mrs. Gibbons said no at once. Mrs. Holland followed suit, a beat too late. Susan Miller hesitated, then said she supposed children sometimes called out when passing by. No one looked at the marbles on the desk, but Miss Marple felt their presence like a quiet accusation. Later, as dusk crept into Rosewood Lane, Miss Marple walked once more past the rose garden. The disturbed soil remained, now shadowed and indistinct. She imagined a figure standing there, tapping sharply on the glass, holding up something bright and familiar to catch Mrs. Turner's eye. A small thing, easily dismissed. A thing that might make a woman rise abruptly from her chair. Behind her, voices drifted from the house. Inspector Slack wrapping up, witnesses departing with murmured relief. Yet Miss Marple felt no such relief. The voices she had heard were careful, shaped, each telling a truth that concealed another beneath it. Someone had wanted Mrs. Turner to come to the window. Someone had known exactly how to draw her attention. And someone, Miss Marple was certain, had already spoken too much, and not enough at the same time. Miss Marple spent the evening in quiet reflection, sitting by her window with a cup of tea while the last amber light fell across Rosewood Lane. The voices of the witnesses and suspects still lingered in her mind, each fragment of speech a thread that might lead somewhere, or deliberately mislead. She knew, as she always did, that motive often hid behind polite smiles and rehearsed denials, a shadow lurking just beyond immediate perception. The nephew, for instance, had been eager to reassure the police of his grief over his aunt's death, yet his insistence struck Miss Marple as a little too rehearsed. He had been abroad for months, yet letters suggested he had recently contacted Mrs. Turner regarding the sale of some of her property. Greed, Miss Marple noted quietly, was seldom absent from disputes over inheritance, and the timing was curious. He had little reason to appear genuinely distressed when he might gain materially from her passing. Then there was Edwin Clark, the former gardener. His indignation at the mere suggestion of suspicion seemed overdone, almost defensive in a way that drew attention rather than deflected it. He had been dismissed for what Mrs. Turner called carelessness with the rosebeds, but Miss Marple wondered whether pride or resentment might have lingered. Pride, she knew, could turn to subtle revenge, and subtle revenge could be executed with deceptive cunning. Clark's alibi was vague, and while it could be true, it also had a convenient vagueness that suggested planning. The neighbours, too, provided motives that were less tangible but no less intriguing. Mrs. Holland's insistence on the exact timing of Mrs. Turner's appearance at the window seemed overly precise. Polite gossip rarely pinned moments down so tightly, unless one had a personal stake in the narrative. Perhaps she wished to establish herself as reliable in the eyes of the authorities, or perhaps she wanted to mislead. Mr. Pierce, on the other hand, had painted a stranger in the neighbourhood, a figure more shadow than substance, yet the fear he introduced hinted at personal anxieties, the kind that could magnify ordinary events into threatening ones. Even Susan Miller, who appeared the most innocent, carried an unspoken tension. Her hesitation about the knock on the glass, and the way her eyes drifted toward the garden when questioned, suggested she had seen more than she admitted, or perhaps feared acknowledging. Young people sometimes withhold truths out of caution or embarrassment, but Miss Marple knew that fear could act as a shield for motives hidden from others. Perhaps Susan had reasons to protect someone, or to protect herself from scrutiny. Miss Marple considered the marble again, turning it gently between her fingers. It was not merely a toy, it was a deliberate signal, a catalyst meant to provoke a response. Whoever had placed it in the room had known exactly how Mrs. Turner would react. That knowledge alone required familiarity with her habits, with her predictability. Only someone close, or someone who had observed her carefully, could have orchestrated such a precise enticement. The tangled web O.F. motives began to clarify in subtle ways. Greed, yes, perhaps in the nephew's desire for property. Resentment, possibly in Clark's wounded pride. Fear, hesitation, and misplaced loyalty in the neighbours and the young visitor. And somewhere, threaded through all of it, a careful knowledge of Mrs. Turner's habits, used to provoke her and manipulate her movements. Each motive alone explained only a fraction of the puzzle. Together, they created a labyrinth in which the simplest action, stepping to the window, picking up a marble, could be guided, even controlled by unseen hands. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the garden once more as dusk turned twilight. Shadows crept across the carefully trimmed roses, casting shapes that seemed almost alive. Each shadow mirrored a hidden intention, each whisper of wind a suggestion of concealed movement. The crime was neither impulsive nor random. It was deliberate, calculated, and informed by a deep understanding of the victim's predictable nature, and if one could read the motives carefully enough, one could trace the invisible hand behind the event. By the time the street lamps flickered on, casting a soft glow over Rosewood Lane, Miss Marple had begun to form a clearer picture, not of the exact moment of the crime, but of the forces that had led to it. Each suspect was implicated in some degree, yet none fully. To untangle the web, she would need to observe more closely, listen more carefully, and wait for the precise misstep that would reveal the hand guiding the shadows. And she knew, as always, that patience and a keen eye would uncover what hurried inspections and blunt questions could not. The maze of motives was intricate, but impenetrable. The next morning brought with it a flurry of official excitement. Inspector Slack appeared at the Turner house with a triumphant air, waving a small bundle of papers. "We've traced a handwriting sample," he announced to the assembled neighbours, "and it matches a note found in the nephew's letters. It seems we have our culprit." The room hummed with relief and speculation, and even Mrs. Gibbons allowed herself a small, tentative smile. Everyone seemed satisfied that the mystery had been neatly resolved. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly observant in the corner, her hands folded over her teacup. She noted the subtle shift in tension, the kind of relaxation that comes when the world convinces itself a puzzle has been solved, even if some corners remain unexamined. The handwriting match was impressive, certainly, but it did not explain the placement of the marble, the soft bruise at the base of Mrs. Turner's skull, or the impression in the garden soil, explained part of the motive perhaps, but only part. Inspector Slack called the nephew on the telephone, reading the handwriting evidence aloud. The young man's protests were genuine enough over the line, though he could not fully account for the letter's existence. The inspector smiled and made notes about a confession in writing, and already he began to formulate the announcement to the press. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, could not help but notice how neatly this supposed solution overlooked inconvenient details. Later that morning, she wandered again through the rose garden. The soil had settled, but the faint heel mark was still there in her mind, and the disturbed petals on the window sill remained vivid in her memory. She imagined Mrs. Turner's final movements, rising at the sharp knock, startled by the marble's sudden appearance, and then struck from behind. None of these movements fit neatly into the nephew's remote alibi. The letter, while incriminating in one sense, failed to account for the timing, the window, and the intricate orchestration that had led Mrs. Turner to the fatal position. Miss Marple also noted small inconsistencies in the witnesses' accounts. Mrs. Gibbons's over-eagerness now seemed more peculiar than ever. Had she wished to close the case early, to direct suspicion elsewhere, or had she simply misremembered in a desire to appear dutiful? The neighbours' recollections were inconsistent in ways too pointed to dismiss, and Susan Miller's hesitation over the knock on the glass remained unexplained. It was not the nephew's distant letters that had compelled Mrs. Turner to rise from her chair. It was the calculated signal, the clever manipulation of her predictable habits. As the day wore on, Slack prepared to submit his report, convinced he had neatly tied up loose ends. Miss Marple offered polite observations on minor inconsistencies, which he nodded at absently. "Perhaps," he said, "but the main thread is clear." Miss Marple said nothing, for she knew the main thread was never truly clear until all the minor threads had been carefully examined. That evening she walked past the Turner house once more. The lights were dimmed, and a shadow flitted across one of the upstairs windows. It was nothing unusual, just a neighbour checking curtains perhaps, but Miss Marple's intuition pricked. The criminal, she realised, was still at large. The supposed breakthrough had been a convenient misdirection, a false victory that allowed the real orchestrator to remain hidden. Whoever had plotted Mrs. Turner's final movements knew enough to manipulate the scene and plant suspicion elsewhere, to let others feel they understood when, in truth, they had grasped only the surface. Returning to her own parlour, Miss Marple sat quietly, letting her mind retrace every movement, every statement, every subtle clue she had observed over the past day. She thought of the marble, the bruise, the displaced knitting needle, the faint heel print, the hesitation in voices, the overly precise recollections, and the slight tremor in otherwise calm expressions. Everything pointed to a hand more careful, more deliberate than the nephew's impulsive letters. By the time the street was empty and Rosewood Lane slept under its soft night sky, Miss Marple's resolve had crystallized. She knew the investigation was far from over. The false victory had provided the authorities with a comforting conclusion, but to her the true picture was still incomplete. Someone remained hidden in the shadows, patient and watchful, their motive and method waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And she, quietly and unobserved, would be ready. Miss Marple awoke early the following morning with a sense of quiet urgency. The false victory of the day before, neatly wrapped and already accepted by the authorities, sat uneasily in her mind. As she prepared her tea, her thoughts returned to the Turner family history, the seemingly insignificant details that neighbours had casually mentioned over the years, and the way old grievances often lingered longer than polite society admitted. Crimes, she knew, rarely sprang from a single impulse. They were echoes of old wounds, carefully reawakened. She began by revisiting the letters from the nephew that Inspector Slack had relied upon so heavily. On closer inspection, the handwriting did match, but the words themselves seemed strangely formal, almost mechanical, lacking the subtle urgency of someone attempting to influence another person. It was as though the letters had been written for an audience, not for the aunt herself. Miss Marple's mind began to consider others who might have known of them, or who might have deliberately used them to mislead. The thought led her naturally to Edwin Clark, the dismissed gardener. She remembered a minor detail from the dismissal. The gardener had been reprimanded not for negligence with the roses themselves, but for a mislaid key to the tool shed. The key had been found, months later, hidden in a flower pot. The oversight had seemed trivial at the time, but Miss Marple began to see it differently. A man who held a grudge, who had once been humiliated, could plan with care over months, even years. Resentment, she thought, was patient. Turning her attention to the neighbours, she recalled that Mr. Pierce had mentioned a stranger in a dark coat, someone whose description varied each time it was told. A casual observation at first, but now it seemed more like a signal, a warning, or perhaps an echo of something more personal. Miss Marple remembered the old Pierce family dispute with the Turners overland at the far edge of the village decades ago, a feud so long buried that no one considered it relevant, yet sufficiently potent to leave lingering resentments across generations. Her mind then returned to Susan Miller, the young woman's hesitation over the knock on the glass, the way her eyes shifted toward the garden, suggested more than ordinary caution. Miss Marple recalled a long-forgotten incident. Susan's father, a minor solicitor, had once represented Mrs. Turner in a small property dispute. There had been an argument, overheard in passing, that left a bitter memory on all sides. It was not ill will in its full-blown form, only a residual tension, subtle but real, a thread from the past reaching into the present. Miss Marple began to see the pattern. Each person connected to Mrs. Turner, however loosely, carried a history, grudges, rivalries, misunderstandings, that could be leveraged with careful manipulation. The letters, the garden soil, the marble, even the misplaced knitting needle, each element was part of a choreography that depended on knowledge accumulated long before the fatal day. The crime was not simply the result of a single motive in the moment. It was the culmination of relationships and past grievances layered and intertwined. She took another walk past the Turner house, the morning light revealing the rose garden in subtle shades. Each rose, perfectly trimmed, seemed a metaphor for control, for expectations, for the invisible hand that shaped Mrs. Turner's life and now her death. Miss Marple pictured the sequence once more. A tap on the glass, a carefully placed marble, the movement to the window, the strike from behind. None of it could have been improvised. It required planning, observation, and an intimate understanding of habits formed over years. The past had instructed the present, and the present had executed the plan with precision. Returning home, she sat at her small writing desk, pen in hand, and began to draw connections that others had missed. The nephew's letters, Clark's lingering resentment, the old Pierce family feud, Susan Miller's inherited unease. Each was a piece of a larger puzzle. Alone, each might mislead. Together, they formed a lattice of influence, guiding actions, shaping perceptions, and ultimately steering Mrs. Turner to her fate. Miss Marple understood now that the crime could not be solved by examining the scene alone. One had to read the lives that touched it, the lingering echoes of old conflicts, and the quiet manipulations that passed unnoticed. By midday, a plan had formed in her mind. She would need to observe, to listen, and to test assumptions carefully. The shadows of the past had provided her with the first true illumination of the present, and somewhere among these intertwined histories, the real hand behind the crime awaited exposure, unsuspecting that Miss Marple was already tracing its hidden movements with patient certainty. Miss Marple spent the afternoon preparing her approach with quiet deliberation, knowing that the truth would not reveal itself through conventional questioning alone. She had the movements of everyone involved, the seemingly insignificant gestures, the faint hesitations, the small overemphasis, the letters, the marble, the garden soil, even the tilt of the knitting needles, all were fragments pointing toward a methodical mind at work. But methodical minds could be tempted to reveal themselves if confronted with something just slightly out of place, a disruption of the carefully constructed narrative. By early evening, she arranged to return to the Turner house, ostensibly to examine the garden once more. Inspector Slack had left for a scheduled meeting with higher authorities, leaving her the freedom to observe and interact unhurriedly. She greeted Mrs. Gibbons politely, commenting on how quiet the lane felt now that the excitement had momentarily subsided. Then, with gentle persistence, she requested permission to see the attic, explaining that old photographs and records might illuminate family history. The housekeeper hesitated, then acquiesced. The attic was a small, dust-laden space filled with trunks and stacks of boxes, long neglected. Miss Marple moved carefully among them, lifting lids and peering into compartments. One box contained letters, not those of the nephew but of Mrs. Turner herself, written years ago to various local acquaintances. She opened one and read it quietly, a careful note, mundane at first glance, but it referenced a minor dispute involving a garden tool, a disagreement over a boundary and a forgotten debt. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. These were the threads that, when tugged correctly, might unravel the present deception. She then asked Mrs. Gibbons whether anyone had entered the attic recently. The woman's ice tightened. "No, Miss Marple. I don't think so." The hesitation was slight, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. People rarely lied outright. They faltered, they overcorrected, or they added unnecessary emphasis. Returning to the garden, she decided to employ a tactic she had found effective on more than one occasion. She would stage a subtle scenario, a psychological nudge to see who reacted. She retrieved a small, ordinary marble from her pocket, one that matched the red glass one in the morning room in size and weight, and placed it on the window-sill, just as Mrs. Turner's would have rested. Then she casually mentioned to Mrs. Gibbons that it had been found in the neighbour's yard earlier that morning. She watched closely as the housekeeper bent to adjust the shutters. It was a subtle cue, nothing overt, but Mrs. Gibbons froze mid-motion, her hand lingering on the latch far longer than necessary. Her eyes darted toward the window, then back at Miss Marple, and she let out a barely audible sigh. The reaction was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet enough. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The subtle dissonance revealed that the housekeeper knew more about the marble than she had admitted. Later, Miss Marple invited Susan Miller to walk with her along the garden path, under the pretence of discussing Mrs. Turner's roses. She spoke gently of habits and patterns, of how people sometimes act in ways entirely predictable, yet entirely unexpected. Susan nodded, attentive, but Miss Marple's questions were layered. Small hypotheticals, suggestions of curiosity rather than accusation. Susan flinched at one. What if someone left a small object to draw attention, something seemingly trivial, yet with intent? The young woman's eyes widened, a shadow of discomfort passing across her face before she quickly masked it with casual interest in a nearby rose. Miss Marple took note. People who reacted too quickly, too subtly, to hypothetical scenarios often revealed knowledge they were not meant to disclose. A small twitch, a hesitation, a change in breathing. These were the cracks in the careful facade, and cracks, she knew, were openings for insight. By dusk, the patterns were clearer. Mrs. Gibbons had reacted to the marble in a way that suggested more than ordinary housekeeping interest. Susan Miller had betrayed a flicker of recognition at the notion of deliberate provocation. Both reactions were small, almost imperceptible, yet together they hinted at a deeper awareness of the events surrounding Mrs. Turner's death. Miss Marple realized she now held the key to separating those who merely observed from those who had actively participated in, or at least understood, the orchestration of the crime. As twilight deepened over Rosewood Lane, Miss Marple felt a thrill of anticipation. The unconventional clue, the marble, a psychological nudge, had drawn from the shadows the faintest tremor of truth. Someone's carefully constructed deception had begun to falter, and from that subtle weakness she would soon unravel the thread that led to the real criminal, hidden yet so close, waiting for the moment to reveal themselves. The following morning, Miss Marple returned to the Turner house with a quiet sense of purpose, determined to examine the writing desk once more. Overnight, her mind had traced the possibilities, reviewed reactions, and pieced together motives in her usual methodical way. The marble and the subtle responses it had elicited were now part of a growing framework, and she intended to expand it. She moved through the morning room with careful observation, noting the way the sunlight struck the polished wood and the faint dust lines that revealed long-ago shifts in objects. But as she approached the desk, a small, sharp shock of unease stopped her. The child's red glass marble, once carefully resting on the blotter, was gone. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the floor, the rug, and even the window-sill, but it had vanished entirely. The room, otherwise untouched since her last visit, seemed somehow subtly altered. A slight indentation on the blotter suggested it had been removed deliberately, as though someone had anticipated she would notice it. Mrs. Gibbons arrived moments later, her face pale. I don't understand, Miss Marple," she stammered. "It was right here yesterday morning. I didn't touch it." Her voice held a tremor that could have been fear, or the guilt of concealment. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind worked faster than ever. "Someone has taken it," she said quietly, "perhaps hoping it will never be found. The marble is no longer merely a toy, it is a key, and someone wishes to hide the truth it represents." A knock at the door interrupted them. Inspector Slack entered, notebook in hand, and immediately noted the tension. "Something wrong?" he asked. "The marble is gone," Miss Marple explained. "It was here yesterday, and now it has disappeared." Slack's brow furrowed, and he muttered something about careless housekeeping. But Miss Marple knew better. Evidence did not vanish by accident, particularly when the disappearance served to obscure the very link she had discovered. She turned her attention to subtle signs. The blotter's slight indentation suggested the marble had been lifted carefully, almost reverently. No fingerprints other than Mrs. Gibbons's would be easily found, but the movement implied someone familiar with the room, someone aware of its significance. Miss Marple's thoughts immediately returned to Susan Miller. The young woman had reacted to the psychological nudge, revealing a flicker of knowledge she had not intended to display. Was it possible she, or someone connected to her, had realized the marble's importance and removed it to protect themselves or another? The situation grew more tangled as Mrs. Holland arrived, claiming she had noticed nothing unusual the previous evening. Mr. Pierce appeared soon after, eager to provide his own observations, but none that addressed the marble. Each account seemed rehearsed, intended to reassure rather than illuminate. Miss Marple sensed the subtle tightening of control. Someone was deliberately shaping perceptions, managing information, and, most critically, eliminating inconvenient truths. Later that day, she examined the window and garden path once more. The soil impressions were undisturbed, yet she could sense that the choreography of events, the knock, the marble, the movement to the window, had been carefully planned by someone fully aware of the importance of every element. By removing the marble, that person had attempted to erase a link between action and motive, between suspicion and revelation. Miss Marple reflected on the disappearing evidence as she walked back to her home, the quiet of Rosewood Lane falling around her. The stakes had risen, someone knew the investigation was closing in, and they were willing to interfere directly. Trust, she understood, had become fragile. The neighbours, the household staff, even the young Susan Miller, could no longer be assumed to be entirely forthcoming. The crime was now entwined with deliberate obfuscation, and anyone who had handled the marble or known its significance was complicit in that act of concealment. Yet Miss Marple felt no discouragement. She understood the nature of those who manipulate evidence. They leave themselves vulnerable to misdirection, overconfidence, and subtle errors. The vanishing marble, rather than removing the path to truth, had illuminated it in an unexpected way. Its absence was itself a clue, pointing to someone who feared discovery, who had acted hastily, and who was watching the investigation closely. In her mind, the invisible hand behind the crime had been drawn into the open, if only slightly, by their own desperate attempt to hide what could not remain hidden forever. By evening, as twilight touched the lane, Miss Marple prepared for the next step. She would watch, she would wait, and she would use the gaps, the hesitations, and the desperate efforts to conceal, to reveal the person who believed they could outwit the quiet, unassuming detective whose insight came not from force or authority, but from patience, observation, and a mind trained to notice the smallest fractures in even the most careful deception. Miss Marple was roused from her early morning reflections by a frantic knock at her door. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face pale and breathless. "It's happened again, Jane! Another tragedy at Rosewood Lane!" She clutched Miss Marple's arm, trembling. The older woman guided her friend inside and poured her a cup of tea. Though neither sipped it, the gardener, Edwin Clark, Mrs. Bantry gasped. He's been found in the lane, unconscious, with the signpost near the old boundary fence." Her words stumbled over themselves as she tried to make sense of the scene. Miss Marple's mind leapt instantly to the implications. Clark had been dismissed months ago, and now, Just as the investigation had begun to circle closer to the truth, he had been attacked. It was no accident. By the time Miss Marple reached Rosewood Lane, the constables were already securing the area. Clark was lying on the grass, bruised but alive, his hat knocked askew, and his face drawn with shock. When he saw Miss Marple, his relief was palpable, yet he struggled to speak. I was just walking past the old fence checking the soil, then something hit me. Didn't see who—" His voice faltered. Inspector Slack, arriving shortly afterward, looked furious and alarmed. "It's obvious now, the perpetrator knows we're closing in. Whoever is behind Mrs. Turner's death is willing to act again to protect themselves." He spoke loudly, gesturing at the street. "They're bold, cunning, and calculating. This is no ordinary attack." Miss Marple, meanwhile, crouched near Clark, observing quietly. The signs were subtle, the bruising was precise. Delivered with knowledge of the human form, the assailant had aimed to incapacitate, not kill. It was a message, she thought, a demonstration of control intended to intimidate and misdirect. The villain remained several steps ahead, but each step left a trace, an invisible footprint if one knew how to read it. As Clark was assisted to the house, Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the lane itself. Footprints in the damp soil suggested movement from both sides, converging near the signpost. They were inconsistent with Clark's own gait, and one set was lighter, more deliberate, hinting at someone careful to avoid leaving excess evidence. She noted the pattern, committing it to memory. Whoever had done this had knowledge of both the victim and the environment, just as they had known precisely how to manipulate Mrs. Turner before. Back inside the Turner house, Miss Marple addressed the gathered witnesses. She asked quietly whether anyone had noticed unusual activity the previous evening. Susan Miller shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door, then away. I thought I saw a figure near the back garden," she admitted hesitantly. "It was dark. I couldn't tell, but it seemed deliberate." The words were small, almost casual, but Miss Marple noticed the tension behind them, the timing, the hesitation, and the choice of phrasing all indicated someone who had observed more than they let on and who feared discovery. Miss Marple's mind began to reconstruct the sequence: the disappearance of the marble, Clark's attack, Susan's observation, all threads leading back to the same hand. She spoke gently, as though to herself rather than anyone in particular. "The person behind this knows exactly how to anticipate reactions. They can manipulate objects, predict movements, and strike precisely when least expected, and they are aware we are searching." Her voice carried calm certainty, but her thoughts raced. If this escalation continued unchecked, someone else could be harmed, or worse. Slack paced the room, muttering about the need for more patrols and immediate surveillance. Miss Marple, however, already had her own plan. Observation, patience, and careful testing would reveal the villain. The criminal was confident, perhaps overconfident, and even the best-laid deception could falter under subtle pressure. She considered the previous clues, the marble, the subtle reactions of Mrs. Gibbons and Susan, the soil impressions, and now Clark's targeted assault. By nightfall, she had decided to remain in close proximity to key locations along Rosewood Lane, watching for unusual movements, listening for the slightest irregularities, and mentally preparing for the moment the criminal would reveal themselves through impatience, fear, or carelessness. The unexpected twist, the attack on Clark, had shifted the investigation from solving a murder to preventing another, and Miss Marple, calm and precise as ever, understood that she must act with both caution and acuity. The shadow that had haunted Rosewood Lane was still out there, but now, at last, she could feel its rhythm, its patterns, and the inevitable moment when it would overreach. The night air was cool as Miss Marple walked slowly along Rosewood Lane, the lamps casting long dappled shadows across the pavement. Clark had recovered enough to provide a clearer account of his assault, yet he could offer no clue as to the assailant's identity. The marble, of course, was still missing, and the earlier breakthrough regarding the nephew's letters had long since proven to be a distraction. Yet in the quiet of the lane, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of insight, the subtle clarity that only patience, observation, and memory could provide. She retraced the steps she had already noted, the placement of Mrs. Turner's furniture, the indentation in the rug where she had risen in response to the marble, the disturbed soil in the garden, Clark's position near the signpost, and Susan Miller's hesitation at the slightest mention of provocation. Each fragment seemed isolated, almost trivial, until she noticed something she had overlooked: the rhythm of the garden gate. It clicked differently depending on which hand one used to lift the latch, and more importantly, it produced a faint creak that carried across the lane in a particular pattern. Miss Marple paused. The creak was familiar. She recalled the testimony of Mrs. Gibbons, who had insisted she heard nothing, and the fleeting reaction she had displayed when Miss Marple had used the marble as a subtle psychological cue. It was not the marble itself that had provoked her. Mrs. Gibbons's response had been to the echo of movements, the sound of hinges, and the timing of familiar routines. Small, almost imperceptible auditory cues had been enough to reveal knowledge of the scene to someone who had been there. The insight prompted her to consider the overlooked aspects of the earlier attacks. The nephew's letters, the Arble, Clark's assault, even Susan's reaction. They all shared one common thread. They occurred in response to a trigger, something the criminal knew would elicit a predictable action. The letters had been meant to distract, the marble to provoke, the attack to intimidate, and the observation of Susan to test awareness. The villain was not improvising. Every act was calculated, relying on habits and reactions that had been observed over months, if not years. Returning to the Turner house, Miss Marple examined the windowsill, the desk, and the rug once more. Her gaze lingered on the knitting needles, noting their slight misalignment and the way one had been positioned farther from the chair. It was an insignificant detail to most, but in combination with everything else, it became a marker of movement, the precise choreography that had lured Mrs. Turner into the fatal position. The marble, now vanished, had been only the visible symbol of a larger orchestration, one that depended entirely on understanding human behavior. She then reflected on Clark's attack. The location at the old boundary fence, the way the assailant had approached and retreated, the footprints, all were consistent with someone testing reactions, learning the limits of what they could do without immediate detection. And Susan's hesitation when confronted with the hypothetical of a small object placed to provoke attention now made sense. The young woman had recognized the pattern, subconsciously aware of how objects and cues could manipulate behavior. The realization crystallized in Miss Marple's mind. The key to the case had been in plain sight all along. It was not a single object, not a letter, not Eve. The marble. It was the pattern of human responses, the predictable movements, the minor oversights, the subtle habits that the criminal had observed and exploited. Each incident, each coincidence, had been deliberate, forming a chain that, when read correctly, revealed the orchestrator's methodology. The criminal's genius, if it could be called that, lay not in concealment but in manipulation, in counting on others to overlook the small, seemingly insignificant details. As she stood in the dim light of the garden, Miss Marple's thoughts aligned with a clarity that had eluded her for days. The false breakthroughs, the vanishing evidence, the attempted intimidation, they were all components of a single, coherent design. And now that she understood the pattern, she could predict the next moves, anticipate the reactions, and narrow the circle of possible suspects. The chaos of Rosewood Lane had in fact been a carefully constructed rhythm, one that would ultimately lead to the exposure of the criminal, if she was patient enough to watch closely, to observe carefully, and to act at precisely the right moment. The shadows along the lane no longer seemed merely threatening, they were informative. Every step, every creak, every hesitation became a signal. And in that network of subtle cues, Miss Marple finally held the thread that would unravel the mystery entirely. Miss Marple spent the next morning quietly tracing the movements of everyone connected to Rosewood Lane, letting the events of the previous days settle in her mind like pieces on a chessboard. Clark had recovered enough to provide further testimony about the attack. Susan Miller had been observed behaving more nervously than before, and Mrs. Gibbons continued to hover near the house, her eyes betraying a hint of worry that went beyond mere curiosity. The clues were forming a pattern, and now Miss Marple suspected it was time to look not only at actions, but at the hearts behind them. She called Susan to the garden under the pretext of examining the roses, observing her reactions carefully. The young woman's nervous glances, her almost imperceptible flinches, suggested she still knew more than she admitted. Miss Marple spoke softly, almost conversationally, about habits, predictability, and the ways people unconsciously give themselves away. Susan's lips parted, then she stopped herself. as though weighing the cost of speaking the truth. Miss Marple's eyes, unblinking, coaxed her gently forward. "The truth is often easier than maintaining a story," she said simply. Susan swallowed, then spoke in a hushed voice. I didn't think it mattered at first, but the marble, the knock, the timing, it was all planned. Mrs. Turner, she didn't even realize she was being manipulated." Her voice trembled. "It was someone who wanted to prove something, that they could control everything. Not money, not revenge, something else." Miss Marple nodded, her mind aligning the threads. Control, the repeated manipulations, the staged provocations, the vanishing evidence. All were designed not to benefit materially, but to assert dominance over the lives around the criminal. She reflected on Clark's attack, precise and restrained. The letters, the marble, the psychological nudges, all served to confirm that this was a mind obsessed with mastery, with demonstrating superiority through carefully orchestrated fear and influence. It was Mrs. Gibbons who, upon being observed later in the afternoon, provided the final insight. She had been tidying the sitting room when Miss Marple noted a sudden sharp glance toward the sideboard, followed by a quick, almost imperceptible tightening of her hands. Miss Marple asked casually about minor household matters, but the question seemed to prick the housekeeper's conscience. I just wanted to keep things orderly," Mrs. Gibbons said nervously, avoiding eye contact. Yet Miss Marple saw the hesitation and the micro-expression of triumph barely concealed. This was the person who had orchestrated the manipulations, who had exploited the predictable habits of Mrs. Turner and everyone around her. The true motive now became clear. It was a need to control, to manipulate life itself as a demonstration of intellect and dominance. Money, inheritance, and old grudges were merely convenient tools, secondary concerns that masked a far deeper obsession. Miss Marple recalled the meticulous timing of the marble, the precise placement of objects, and the careful orchestration of reactions. Each act was a puzzle in which the criminal delighted, not merely a step toward material gain. Even the attack on Clark was a calculated test, a demonstration of capability without lethality, intended to prove a point to those who might observe, to intimidate and assert control. Miss Marple gathered the key points in her mind. The criminal had studied habits and routines for months, maybe years, predicting behavior and manipulating responses with near-perfect precision. Their goal was psychological: to dominate, to prove superiority, to orchestrate fear and submission in the quietest, subtlest ways. It was chilling, because it revealed a mind entirely consumed with influence, seeing people not as companions or neighbors, but as instruments in an elaborate experiment of control. By evening, she had the clarity she needed. The villain's identity was no longer abstract. It was tangible, rooted in patterns of behavior, reactions to subtle cues, and a psychological compulsion that drove the crime. What had appeared at first as a conventional murder or act of revenge was, in reality, a carefully staged demonstration of dominance, an obsession that had consumed the perpetrator and left tragedy in its wake. Miss Marple knew now that understanding this hidden motive was the key not only to explaining the past events, but to predicting the criminal's next move. Rosewood Lane, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, seemed deceptively calm, yet beneath that calm lay a mind still active, still scheming, still confident in its ability to outwit others. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly in quiet determination. She had glimpsed the true depth of the obsession, the driving force behind the chaos, and with that understanding she could move forward, not merely to uncover the truth, but to bring the hidden hand behind it all into the light before it could strike again. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon quietly preparing, arranging the elements of a subtle but precise trap. She had traced the threads of the crime, understood the villain's psychological obsession with control, and now it was only a matter of drawing the perpetrator out in a situation where their own compulsion would betray them. She did not hurry, for she knew that a careful, composed approach was far more effective than haste. By early evening she invited Clark and Susan Miller to sit with her in the Turner sitting room under the pretense of reviewing the sequence of events for the authorities. The two young witnesses were anxious, but trusted her implicitly. Miss Marple spoke gently of habits, reactions, and the ways even careful people left themselves exposed. Her conversation was casual, but every word was deliberate, every anecdote a calculated hint designed to elicit the next move from the true criminal. Soon Mrs. Gibbons entered, carrying a tray of tea with her habitual air of domestic propriety. She appeared calm, polite, and deferential, yet Miss Marple's keen eye noticed the slight flicker of alertness as she glanced at the window where the marble had once rested. She did not yet speak, but she was watching, waiting, as Miss Marple had predicted. "Mrs. Gibbons," Miss Marple said softly, drawing the woman's attention to a simple, unremarkable object on the table, a small, polished marble identical to the one that had vanished days before. She placed it deliberately in the centre of the tray, then leaned back in her chair, sipping her own tea with serene composure. "Curious how objects can appear and disappear, isn't it? And how certain people seem particularly aware of them." Mrs. Gibbons stiffened, her hand gripping the tray just a fraction too tightly. Her eyes flicked toward the marble, then toward the window, and finally back at Miss Marple. I don't understand what you mean," she said, her voice a touch too high, her words overly measured. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to stretch, then continued with a casual one of an observer, not an accuser. "It's funny, isn't it, how certain routines and habits reveal more than the most careful testimony. One sees, one notices, and one sometimes acts without thinking, believing no one is watching." She let the words hang, watching for the reaction she knew would come. It came almost immediately. Mrs. Gibbons's gaze dropped to the marble, then back to Miss Marple, and her hands tightened over the tray, as though she were suppressing a sudden impulse. I didn't mean," she stammered, but no more words came. Her carefully constructed composure was cracking, ever so slightly, betraying the intensity of her hidden obsession with control. Miss Marple leaned forward gently, her voice calm but insistent. "No one here wishes to accuse without reason, but sometimes the truth is the easiest way to restore order. You watched, you arranged, and you orchestrated events, did you not? You could not resist the temptation to prove how much influence you had, even if it meant guiding Mrs. Turner to harm." The housekeeper's face turned pale and she swallowed hard. For a brief moment, the room seemed suspended, the three onlookers tense, the shadows along the walls deepening as the weight of the confrontation settled. Then, in a tremulous whisper, she admitted it. I only wanted to demonstrate, to prove that I didn't mean for her to. The words tumbled out in fragments, revealing the obsessive compulsion Miss Marple had anticipated, the need to dominate, to control, to orchestrate. There was a sudden shift in Mrs. Gibbons's demeanour, a last desperate attempt to flee the exposure. She made a move toward the door, but Miss Marple was repaired. A soft, deliberate step, and a hand lightly resting on the doorknob halted her. "There's no need to run," Miss Marple said softly. "Everything is understood now, and everything will be explained properly. You will have the chance to answer for your actions, and the truth will no longer hide in the shadows." Mrs. Gibbons sank into a chair, trembling, her need for control finally yielding to the inexorable clarity of the moment. She confessed in detail the manipulation of Mrs. Turner, the placement of the marble, the subtle signals, even the attack on Clark. Each action had been meticulously calculated, driven not by money or vengeance, but by the overwhelming compulsion to dominate, to prove herself intellectually superior, to orchestrate events as if life itself were her puzzle. Miss Marple listened with serene patience, allowing the confession to unfold. Outside, the lane lay quiet, unaware of the revelation taking place within the house. By the time Mrs. Gibbons had finished, the truth was complete, the web of deception untangled, and the hidden motive laid bare for all to see. Miss Marple's careful preparation, her patient observation, and her subtle manipulation of the environment had succeeded. The criminal had revealed themselves, driven not by fear of discovery but by the very compulsion that had caused the tragedy in the first place. As the evening deepened, Inspector Slack arrived once more, ready to take statements and secure the necessary evidence. Miss Marple, calm and composed, knew that justice would follow, that the danger had passed, and that the quiet streets of Rosewood Lane would, at last, be free from the shadow that had haunted them for so long. The days that followed Mrs. Gibbons' confession were calm on the surface. Inspector Slack made his report, neighbours murmured about the shocking revelations, and the Turner house slowly returned to its quiet, orderly state. Miss Marple, however, remained restless, confession or no confession, something about sequence of events, the precision of the attacks, and the disappearance of the marble still did not sit right. She reviewed her notes, replaying each observation in her mind, and the faint, persistent feeling of incompleteness tugged at her thoughts. It was Susan Miller who inadvertently provided the spark of insight. The young woman had come to deliver a bouquet of roses to Miss Marple, shyly mentioning that she had found something curious while tidying the attic. She hesitated before revealing it, a small notebook bound in worn leather, with entries that detailed observations of the Turner household, movements, habits, even the timings of letters and visitors. The writing was neat, meticulous, and completely unfamiliar to anyone Miss Marple had considered until now. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She flipped through the pages with careful attention, noting the obsessive detail, the daily routines of Mrs. Turner, the precise timing of the marble's placement, the subtle cues that prompted certain reactions, and even the careful recording of Clark's movements in the garden. Whoever had kept this notebook had been observing, planning, and calculating for months, if not years, and it was not Mrs. Gibbons. A slow, deliberate realization settled over her. Mrs. Gibbons had acted, yes, but she had acted as an instrument, a hand guided by someone else's orchestration. The real mastermind had remained in the shadows all along, using Mrs. Gibbons's compulsions to execute the plan while keeping themselves invisible. Miss Marple recalled the careful manipulations, the subtle psychological nudges, the vanishing marble, Clark's assault, all events that had seemed like demonstrate. Ions of control, but were, in fact, tests to ensure the reliability of a subordinate. Miss Marple glanced up and considered the people around Rosewood Lane. Who had the intellect, the patience, and the opportunity to compile such detailed notes without arousing suspicion? The answer, when it struck, was as simple as it was chilling. Someone close to the household, someone trusted, someone whose actions had appeared benign or even helpful. And the clues had been there all along. The casual remarks, the faintly too perfect observations, the ways in which certain people seemed to know things they had no reason to know. She gathered Clark and Susan Miller in the sitting room once more, recounting the notebook's contents without yet revealing her suspicions. The two listened, increasingly tense, as Miss Marple described how meticulous records of every minor habit and routine had been kept, how objects had been placed to provoke predictable reactions, and how the timing of each event had been orchestrated with preternatural precision. Then, quietly, she looked toward the only other figure present in the room, the Turners' long-time neighbour, Mr. Pierce. He had visited under the pretext of checking in, his manner entirely polite, even genial, but Miss Marple had never quite accepted the ease with which he navigated the household. His subtle comments, the occasional questions that seemed innocuous, his interest in the timing of letters and movements, it all suddenly fell into place. He had been the quiet observer, the one who had guided Mrs. Gibbons like a chess piece, ensuring the perfect execution of his plan without ever touching the stage himself. Miss Marple's voice was calm, yet carried the undeniable weight of certainty. Mr. Pierce, it seems that the notebook you would never have needed to handle, the timing of events and the subtle manipulations, all point to someone who orchestrated this tragedy from behind the scenes. The hand that directed the sequence, ensured the responses, and guided Mrs. Gibbons's actions belonged to you, does it not? Pierce's face betrayed the smallest flicker of recognition, a micro-expression that passed too quickly for anyone but Miss Marple to notice. He attempted a polite denial, his words measured, but his eyes betrayed him, the corner of a smile, a flash of tension, the almost imperceptible inclination to flee or justify. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Control and observation are not crimes in themselves," she said softly, "but when they are used to orchestrate harm, the truth finds its way, as it always does. The notebook, the subtle patterns, the vanishing marble, these are not accidents, they are your design." Pierce's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his hat, realizing the delicate web of manipulation he had constructed had finally unravelled. He could try to argue, deny, or escape, but Miss Marple's serene gaze held him, and he knew that his calculated control had come to an end. The mastermind, hidden in plain sight, was at last exposed, not by force, not by evidence alone, but by the relentless clarity of a mind trained to read the smallest fractures in deception. Rosewood Lane, quiet once more, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple's insight had pierced the final veil, revealing the architect of the tragedy and ensuring that the shadow which had haunted the lane would not remain unchawed. Even in the calm that followed, she understood the lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous hand is the one that appears entirely benign, the one no one suspects, and the one whose obsession with control is hidden beneath a mask of courtesy and neighbourly concern. The revelation of Mr. Pierce's role sent a palpable shock through the Turner household. Clark, Susan, and even Mrs. Bantry could scarcely believe that the mild-mannered neighbour, who had always greeted them politely, had orchestrated so much chaos from behind the scenes. Inspector Slack moved immediately to secure the situation, preparing to take Pierce into custody. Yet, even as the officers approached, Miss Marple felt the familiar tug of unease. She had exposed the mastermind, yes, but there was still a subtle tension in the room, a feeling that the story was not yet fully concluded. Pierce, for his part, remained outwardly composed, but Miss Marple observed the micro-expressions that betrayed him, the slight shift of weight, the fleeting glance toward the window, the tightening of his hands. He had been caught, but he was calculating, still assessing every option. "I suppose you believe you have unravelled everything, Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice measured, almost amused. "But perhaps you have only glimpsed the surface." Miss Marple's calm gaze did not waver. "Every sequence, every movement, every subtle reaction you relied upon has been accounted for," she replied evenly. "The marble, the letters, the notebook, the minor disruptions, you manipulated them all to orchestrate fear and assert control. Yet in doing so, you left yourself vulnerable in the details no one else considered. The very obsession that drove you has betrayed you." Pierce's lips pressed together. For a moment, there was the faintest flicker of defiance, the ghost of an escape plan forming behind his eyes. Then, almost imperceptibly, he slumped into resignation as officers closed in. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sigh. Justice, at least for the moment, seemed secure. Yet even as he was escorted away, she noted the subtle way his gaze lingered on the attic window, on the garden path, as if the game were not yet entirely finished. Once the house had quieted, Miss Marple gathered the remaining occupants and began to explain the hidden patterns, the clues that others had overlooked. The marble, she said, was not merely a toy. Its placement, removal, and timing were designed to provoke reactions, to test comprehension and control. Mrs. Gibbons, who executed these actions under his direction, revealed her own complicity through micro-expressions and small hesitations. Clark's attack was similarly orchestrated, not to harm but to intimidate and ensure obedience. Susan Miller's reactions were a subtle mirror of understanding, highlighting knowledge that even she had not consciously realized. She paused, allowing the connections to settle. The notebook was the final piece. Observations recorded over months, detailing routines, movements, and reactions revealed the hand behind the orchestration. Yet it was not mere observation that mattered. The villain's compulsion, their need to dominate, caused them to leave traces in patterns and behavior, traces invisible to those who relied solely on surface appearances. As she spoke, Clark nodded slowly, comprehension dawning. "So everything, the marble, the letters, the timing, it wasn't random?" "Not random at all," Miss Marple replied. "Every element was intentional, a demonstration of control, and it is precisely because of that overconfidence, that reliance on predictability, that the perpetrator has been exposed. Had they acted purely for material gain, the clues might never have emerged." Susan Miller, still pale but more composed, asked quietly, "And justice will truly be served?" Miss Marple looked out the window toward the fading light over Rosewood Lane. "The law will address the consequences, yes, but it is worth remembering that even when a criminal is caught, the memory of their influence lingers. Patterns of control, subtle manipulations, and the shadow of fear are not always erased. We are fortunate to have prevented further tragedy, but the mind that orchestrated these events has already left its mark." The quiet of the lane settled around them, a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Justice had been delivered in the sense that the culprit was in custody, yet the unsettling truth remained. The villain's genius had brought chaos to the ordinary lives of the neighborhood, and that genius had only been caught by the careful eye of a detective, who noticed the details others dismissed. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile, not of triumph but of recognition. The case was resolved, yet the shadows of human cunning had been laid bare, and she had once again been the one to see through them. As she stepped out into the evening air, the lane quiet and almost serene, she reflected that true insight required patience, observation, and the ability to read not just actions but the invisible motives behind them. Rosewood Lane would return to its peaceful routine, but the lessons of control, obsession, and subtle deception would linger in her mind, a reminder that even in calm surroundings, the quietest hands can cast the longest shadows. The days that followed felt unusually still along Rosewood Lane. The Turner house had regained a fragile calm, neighbours resumed their ordinary routines, and the authorities, confident that the culprit had been apprehended, began to close their files. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual quiet vigilance, strolling through the garden and along the lane, observing the subtle rhythms of life that most people overlooked. The marble was never found, the notebook had been secured, and Mr. Pierce was in custody, yet a faint, persistent unease tugged at the edges of her thoughts. She paused beneath the old elm by the boundary fence, where Clark had been attacked. The soil had settled, the footprints erased by wind and rain, yet the memory of the careful orchestration lingered. Her mind traced the sequence of events, replaying reactions and patterns, cross-referencing habits with the psychological cues she had observed. Everything seemed resolved, yet she could not dismiss the feeling that the full story had not yet emerged. Walking back toward the Turner house, she noticed a small envelope, half hidden beneath the rose bushes. The handwriting was unfamiliar, delicate and precise, and it carried no stamp, clearly delivered by hand. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully and opened it. Inside was a brief note, scarcely more than a line. "You have seen only what I all load. The game is not over." Her lips curved faintly, a mixture of amusement and concern. The message was cryptic, yet it hinted at an awareness of her investigation, a consciousness of her insight, and perhaps even a challenge. Whoever had written it remained unknown, yet the tone suggested intelligence, cunning, and a capacity for subtle manipulation that rivaled the very mind she had just unravelled. She considered the possibilities. Could there be an accomplice? Someone who had watched from the shadows while Pierce orchestrated events through Mrs. Gibbons? Or was it simply a taunt from someone entirely separate, testing the limits of her observation? The questions hung in the air, unresolved but tantalizing, a reminder that the world was never as simple as it seemed. Miss Marple tucked the note into her coat pocket and continued along the lane, her pace unhurried. Clark waved from his garden, tending the roses with renewed care, and Susan Miller passed with a shy smile, evidently comforted by the resolution of the immediate danger. Yet, even among these signs of normalcy, Miss Marple's mind remained alert, noting the tiniest inconsistencies. The way a gate creaked more sharply than expected, the subtle absence of a familiar sound, a shadow that lingered too long near the window. By the time she reached the lane's end, she had made a mental list, patterns observed, manipulations revealed, behaviours tested, and yet one final variable remained unaccounted for. The letter had not named a sender, it had not revealed intention beyond intrigue, and it had left a lingering sense of unfinished business. Miss Marple understood that some mysteries were never fully complete. The unravelling of one thread often revealed another, thinner and more elusive, waiting quietly for the right moment to emerge. She paused, gazing down the lane as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the familiar houses. The evening was peaceful, yet the subtle tension persisted, a whisper of unknown motives and unseen eyes. She smiled faintly, acknowledging the duality of her life as a detective. Each solved case offered satisfaction, closure for others, yet simultaneously reminded her that the world contained endless patterns, subtle manipulations, and the ever-present possibility of human cunning at work. As she turned toward home, the quiet lane stretching behind her, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. Pierce had been caught. Mrs. Gibbons's confessions had clarified the immediate events, and the neighbourhood could breathe again. But the envelope, the cryptic note, and the lingering shadows reminded her that mystery never truly ends. The pieces of the puzzle would always shift slightly, new patterns would emerge, and there would always be another truth waiting in the quiet spaces that others overlooked. The lane, bathed in twilight, seemed ordinary to anyone passing by. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its calm surface lay traces of intelligence, manipulation, and human obsession, the very elements she had spent her life learning to perceive. She smiled once more, a quiet glimmer of anticipation in her eyes. Justice had been served, the immediate danger ended, yet the game was far from over. Somewhere, in the shadows or in a minor, overlooked detail, another mystery waited, ready to be discovered by the same patient, observant mind that had brought Rosewood Lane back from chaos. And with that knowledge, Miss Marple walked on, aware that her work was never truly finished, and the subtle thrill of the unknown always lay just around the next corner.